take it seriously. I lived 6 years in the United States, and I went to the United States initially to do a PhD, to do work. And one of the things that happens to you when you're doing a PhD is you sure do read a lot. And so I read a lot. And then I began to think about what I was reading, and then I began to think of the authors that I was reading. And then I decided that I would, I was going to be an academic, and I was going to spend my life writing articles on other people. So I said, why not write my own stories? And so I did that, and I was not young. Like, everything is relative. I was like 26 or something like that, and it's younger than I am now. But I was kind of serious about this, and I realized that a lot of very good writers wrote from their own experience. They weren't necessarily from New York or from London, although some writers were. It was said of the Brontes, they were too far north, and D.H. Lawrence was from the wrong kind of place, and Thomas Ireland was too far south, and so on. But they persevered. So then I said, well, I'm just going to try and do this. And I was thoughtful and slow about it, and but I didn't mind. I didn't mind being thoughtful, and I didn't really mind being slow either, because I said, I'm just going to do this, and I'm going to do it the best way that I can, and I'm going to ground my work in the place that I know best. So I did, and I think maybe because I was kind of older, like 26, I had almost instant success. I feel almost embarrassed when people say, how many rejection slips did you have? Maybe one. So that's a long-winded answer to your question.
It's the longest-winded answer I've ever heard you give.
The night is young.
When you were writing those stories, were they being published individually in magazines or anything?
Yes. Yeah. They were being published individually in magazines. And I was living in the United States, and I was sending them out to magazines in the United States. And sent them out to good magazines, the Southern Review, Massachusetts Review, and I had kind of following. And 2 or 3 of the stories were chosen for Best American Short Stories of 1969, 1974, and so on. So I had a kind of little reputation. Then I came back to Canada, and then a number of years ago, in New York City, they had a gathering of all the people who had their work published in Best American Short Stories. So I went, and John Updike was there, George Carroll's, and some of these people I knew and some of them I didn't. And I had my little name tag, Jim Appel, Alistair Cloud. Anyway, I had my little name tag, and a man looked at my name tag, and he said, Alistair MacLeod, I thought you died. I said, no, I didn't die. No, I didn't die. I went to Canada. and he went, death, Canada. So it's kind of interesting, but I had a kind of, I still have, because of those early successes, a kind of a little reputation. People who read short stories, they say, oh, he didn't die. He's still alive. So that was something.
Back in the middle of the long-winded answer, I noticed that you dropped the names Hardy and the Brontes and so on. And I know that you taught, your degree was so that you could teach 19th century British literature. So what effect, if any, because maybe it didn't have any effect, did that have on your own writing?
I don't know, but it makes the more you read, I think the more thoughtful you become. And I was thinking, somebody here in one of the sessions that I mentioned, Thomas Hardy, I did a dissertation on Thomas Hardy, and it was on censorship, because certain paragraphs would be purged and they would appear in the American edition, but they wouldn't appear in the British edition. And Thomas Hardy was kind of seen as a kind of dangerous person because he was questioning the existence of God, and he had children born out of wedlock, and he had lots of subjects. I don't know how much you know about the Victorian period, but they used to publish a lot of stories in kind of serial magazines, and you've probably seen, the Victorian mother and the Victorian father sitting in front of the fireplace reading stories to their children, and some of these were Thomas Hardy stories were seen as not suitable for children. And I don't know if Thomas Hardy was, he was very stubborn, but someone like Dickens, when faced with something like that, he would just write around the issue, he would say, describing prostitutes or someone, he would say, alas, she had become one of those poor, lost-lorn creatures that have been, abandoned by society, and the Victorian father and mother could read this, and there was no, little children would know what Dickens was talking about, but they always knew what Thomas Hardy was talking about because he was so blunt. And at one of the sessions I was at earlier, I think John Burnside, who was a session some of you attended, was talking about Thomas Hardy. And Thomas Hardy has a great many coincidences in his novel. People go to meet somebody and they're supposed to go to All Souls Church, and they go to All Saints Church, or they put the letter in the post box and they don't have a stamp on it or something like that. People's lives are kind of affected by coincidences. And I was looking at my own little story, and I said, geez, Thomas Hardy is alive and well inside me somewhere, with these little coincidences that change people's lives.
Wow, that is true. And there are all these little things that are going on in the story that you have to read twice, actually, to catch a lot of them, because the foreshadowing is very subtle and very skillful. Your first book was The Lost Salt Gift of Blood. How did it come into being?
How did it come into being? It's again kind of interesting. I had a short story called In the Fall, and it was published in Tamarack Review, which was after I returned to Canada. And Robert Weaver was the editor of Tamarack Review. And Jack MacLeod, who was the owner-publisher of MacLeod Stewart, wrote me and said, I don't know who you are, but if you have any more stories like this, I will publish them. So there. See, I didn't have no rejection. And it was one, I think Alice Munro had a collection at that time. I think we were the first two almost, I don't know that, but we were two of the few people who published collections of short stories, because, I know you're out there, some people still writing short stories, and they get kind of a hard time sometimes because their agent or the publisher says, we want novels. But going back to Alice Munro, if you look at the success she's had, short stories are great. But that was what happened with Jack MacLeod. And so then I said, well, yes, I have 4 more or 5 more, and he just published them. And so it was, and then, they...
And then everybody waited.
Yes.
Because when I first heard of you, I guess I was working for CBC Radio, and I was in charge of books on the Morningside program. and you were like this sort of legend. There was this guy named MacLeod, who was a magnificent Canadian writer that no one had ever seen or met, and no one knew anything about him. Did the world come to your door after that first collection, and were you not inclined to engage in the sort of the public aspect of publishing?
No, here I am at the Vancouver Arts Festival. I'll engage in publicity. It's just that I was busy, I was teaching at the university, and my wife and I had 6 children, and I spent a lot of time going to hockey rinks and basketball games and piano lessons and so on. And so I had this reputation of being, someone described me as the literary tortoise of the world. I was a tortoise anyway, I was a literary tortoise because I was so slow. And one year, this is kind of funny, one year I was commissioned to write the short story, the Christmas short stories for the Globe and Mail. And this man that commissioned me, I had a kind of sometimes you have relationships with people you've never seen. I'd written to this man, and I'd talked to him, but I didn't know what he looked like, and so on. So he asked me to write the Christmas story, and he said it had to be 6,000 words, which was kind of short for things I write. So I was doing that, and I write in longhand. Every once in a while I'd stop and count the words. And 597. And I would ask hard questions where the articles were words with THEs. That would work. So he wanted the story by November 25th or something, Christmas story, because then he would give the story to the illustrator, and the illustrator would illustrate it based on the story. So he would phone up now and then with little notes of panic in his voice, and I said, "Oh, you'll get it. I'll get it to you." And he said, "I don't know whether I should tell you this or not, but I was talking to a man the other day, and he said, 'Who's writing the Christmas story for you this year?' And he said, 'MacLeod.' And the man said, 'I hope you don't mean this Christmas.'" I thought, not that slow. And then, it was a long time ago. It was very primitive technology. There wasn't even fax machines. And the post office was on strike, and so I sent it on the bus. That's what he told me to do. And I put little brackets around stories, around sentences that he could take out, so we'd come in at 6,000 words. So he phoned up, and I said, "It's on the bus. Check is in the mail." And I said, I put little brackets around sentences, words you could leave out. He said, "How?" After he got it, he said, I said, "You see the little marks?" "Yes." I said, "You can cut those just little pieces of the piece I think you could cut out." He said, "How could you cut that?" I said, "Well, I don't know. You're the person who said 6,000 words. He said, "Oh, we'll just make the illustration smaller." So here I was, counting words, 598, 598. It's that simple. You just make the illustration from this side.
And what was the part of that story where you had to talk to somebody on the telephone? Read the story.
Yes. He said, when I told him it was on the bus, he said, I don't know if he was suspicious or not, he said, "Well, I'll get my secretary to phone you this evening or 4 o'clock or something, and you read it to her."
Just as a backup, right?
Just as a backup. This secretary was not happy. And I would read it, and she would question me, and she was grumpy, I was telling Hallie that I had a word, when grass goes around in the snow, the word was WHORLED. Whorled. So I came to this, and she said, "Whirled." No, I said, "Whirled." She said, "World," W-O-R-L-D. No, I said, "Whirled." And then she said, "Well, I never heard of that kind of a word before." So it was a long, tedious experience, but anyway, the story got a long time. Once it got there, not next Christmas, complete with world.
And I actually invited you to be on Morningside.
Yeah.
Sorry to keep bringing that up. To talk about that story.
Yeah.
And with W.O. Mitchell, who also taught at Windsor. Have you got one great Bill Mitchell story? I mean, it's sad that he's not with us, but boy, did he leave an incredible legacy of stories.
W.O. Mitchell and I were very good friends, and I taught with him at the Banff School of Fine Arts. I was taught at the Banff School of Fine Arts, taught writing for 11 years, and he wasn't there for all of 11 years. But then I went back to Windsor, and he came back to Windsor with me, and he stayed in Windsor for 8 years. So I knew him quite well. I'll tell this one little story. After he had left Windsor, he was back in Calgary, and we were both doing adjudication for our students. And I was in Nova Scotia that winter, and he was in Calgary. And so we were going to meet at Banff and go through the manuscripts and, accept them and so on. And so he talked to me on the phone, and he said, "Well, we'll stay in Calgary the night you come, and then the next morning we'll go to Banff." All right. So I was coming down that escalator in Calgary Airport, and he was there. He had a big fur coat, and he was really grumpy looking, So he said, "We're going to go to Banff tonight." "Oh," I said, dutifully. And so he went out, and the lines of taxis there at airports. He waited for this taxi and said, "Take us to Banff." So the taxi driver was a Sri Lankan medical student. And I don't think he'd ever driven outside Calgary, and he was not used to snow. And I saw him, when he was speaking to dispatch, "Where's Banff?" So we started, and he drove about a mile an hour. So slow, he was frightened, And Mitchell would fall asleep. And he'd say, "Where are we now?" I say, "Exshaw, where the cement goes through no count." He said, "Why is he so damn slow?" I don't know. So, anyway, we were in this wilderness, like the park and the Indian reservation, and there's not many people. It was New Year's Eve, January 2nd, and this elk came right up out of this ditch, and the taxi driver slammed on the brakes, and Mitchell was asleep, and I had read that what you're supposed to do is put your arms around the person in the accident and pull him down the floor. So the elk came up, and I put my arms around W. Mitchell and pulled him down the floor. And he woke up, and he was in my embrace. And the floor was all full of cigarette butts. And he said, "What the hell are you doing?" I explained, and the taxi driver started to cry. And the taxi driver said, "Oh, gentlemen, I do not believe there is a Banff." Mitchell was getting a little bit deaf, and he said, "What is it?" I said, "He says he doesn't believe there's a Banff." "Tell him," he said. So I kind of started a little fantasy, you know, Burger King, lights, gas stations. You know, I was telling him all this about the nature of Banff, and he was looking at me with suspicion. So another 3 hours, we came to the park gates, you know, where you say Banff. It's snowing. He said, "There's Banff." No, I said, further. Further, gas stations. Tim Hortons, I don't know if it was Tim Hortons, but I was trying to do this. And so finally we got to Banff, and it cost an awful lot of money. And we were out all night, creeping along. And the next day, the third person on the jury had slept in her own bed in Calgary, and she came out on the first bus to Banff, and it cost $4.65 or something. Our taxi driver cost a big lot of money, and we were falling asleep all day. But I just remember that poor man. We found out later there was a taxi company in Calgary at that time named Shamrock Taxi, that if you had phoned Shamrock Taxi and said, "I want to go to Banff," they would have sent a driver, you know, who knew the terrain and would have not been afraid of it, you know. This poor man was, but when he said, "Oh, I do not believe there is a Banff." Anyway, the first time I went, I had a Christmas story, and Mitchell had a Christmas story, so we went. And Halloween was our man. I feel like I'm talking an awful lot. Don't ask those hard questions.
No, but that's exactly the story I hoped you would tell. I've heard that you have a cabin in Cape Breton. Is that where you do most of your writing?
Yeah. I do writing there in the summer. It's very isolated, and it's up on a cliff. And I had it built almost 40 years ago, and there's no electricity, and there's no telephone, and there's no running water. And so I just sit there on my chair, and with a little desk, and what else can you do, almost? But right, that's the idea. And it's far away, and like, you know, about a mile from my house, and I built it there so nobody could get me. Now I find I can hardly get to it myself. I was so successful. I have to stop and breathe and say, okay, now. So, yeah, that's what I do.
Is anyone else allowed in? Has any...
A deer came in once. Yeah, it's not very glamorous, although it sounds kind of more exciting than it is. But,
you still write longhand?
Yeah. I like writing long. It's my age, you know. I know there are young writers out there. I wouldn't say, you know, write longhand, but when I write longhand, it seems like it's me, you know. If I were to type it on a computer and it appears on the screen so fast, I think fairies did it. Leprechauns or something, like little creatures. But when I have my little ballpoint pen, then I know people who collect manuscripts just love my work because it's it's really there, you know. It's not like something from a printer. It's got little arrows and things. And you can make marks in the paper.
When I asked you to write this story for us, and I told a paper reporter last week who interviewed me that I was very scared because I thought that you might say no, and the idea of being rejected was horrible to me. And but it was the only way that I could really get you back, because we've talked about at this festival, not me personally, but we've talked about all your previous work. So I thought this was ingenious to say, well, write something for us. And I didn't care whether it was something that you had in the drawer and you just pulled out and said, sure, I can write something for you, and bingo.
I don't have any drawer like that. Go ahead.
I didn't think you did. And you told me that it was not something that you were working on, and it was not something, the idea that you were thinking about. So how did it come to you, and how did it begin to take shape?
Well, I agreed to do this for Al and for the festival because I like him and I like the festival, and so I agreed. But what you have to have when you write a story is an idea. You have to have something to say. It just can't be scribbled on a page, or I don't think you can. So I thought about what I would say, and I thought about it for a while, and I thought of this subject, remembrance, in terms of Remembrance Day, because all the veterans from the First World War are gone, and there's not very many of the Second World War, not very many veterans of the Second World War who are still alive. And so I thought that I would write a story, not necessarily about what happened to people at the front, but a story that had kind of, when you drop a rock in the pool, kind of repercussions on people who were left behind or who were influenced by the war. And I'm not necessarily talking about the occupied lands, the Dutch or the French or whatever, but people who were kind of in faraway Canada who were not under shell fire or anything like that. And so I said, okay, this is what I'm going to do. And then I was thinking who was going to tell a story, because a lot of the sessions we've been at, people talk about point of view and who gets to tell a story and that. So I said, well, I could have my veteran, who would be about 90, tell the story and say, once upon a time I was, but then I didn't want to do that, or I didn't think it would work as well. And so then I told it kind of in the third person. And I was kind of able to avoid the immediate, like I wasn't sure of a 90-year-old man's memory of what it was like when he was 18, So this is how I began. Then I tried this and I tried that. So it worked out all right. Well, I think it worked out all right. It's here anyway. But
we didn't make you read it over the phone.
No, that's just so. When I tell that, it's like I'm like a medieval monk or something. I write the story in longhand and then I talk. It's almost like I was doing semaphore. But I just remember. It was a Friday, and this secretary lady, she was just so annoyed because I think she got this laid on her desk, just when she was going to go home, and she had to listen to this person saying, "Whorl." But anyway, it worked out okay.
So I talked to you before about the writing process. It was actually great to hear you talk about the idea stage, but when you go to the writing part, you've talked in a number of places about how you basically write one sentence at a time, and I wonder if you could tell us how that actually sort of works.
Well, keep talking on it. I write one sentence, and then I read it aloud, and I say, "Oh, that's pretty good." And then I write another sentence, and I read them all aloud because I like to get in rhythm. I like to think that I'm just not giving information. That I wouldn't say I'm questing for beauty or anything. That it sounds so prissy, But I would like to say what I have to say in a kind of nice fashion. There was a man in the 1700s, the Earl of Chesterfield, and he said, "Style is the clothing of thought," which has stayed with me for a long time, because your thought is kind of like your naked body, and then your style is, how you dress up or, the hats you wear or something like that. So you are a person, but how you present your personhood is kind of interesting. So I read everything aloud because I like it to have like a rhythm, you know, and I don't want to just be, you know, writing the directions on the other side of the soup can, or, you know, how to put your bookcase together. Like, that's writing too, and that's giving information. But I like to pretend that I'm, you know, presenting it in kind of a pleasing fashion. And sometimes that works and sometimes it doesn't. But I'm interested in sound, you know, and I think if you're a storyteller, we all know that storytelling is older than literacy. You know, that people were telling stories before they could read or write. And I think, you know, a good storyteller, you know, who could keep people sitting there listening to him or to her, would have something to say, and they would also say it in a certain way that was pleasing to the reader. So I write a sentence, I write another sentence, I write another sentence, I write another sentence, and I don't revise because I just write sentence by sentence. And I don't know if this is, you know, it sounds very slow, but I know who's out there, some of you people out there, like some people I know, they write like a 300-page draft, and then they write a second 300-page draft, and then, you know, they fourth 300-page draft. And that's a lot of work too. So if you're tortoise of the literary world, and you just do one sentence, and then another sentence, and then another sentence.
But okay, I've got a couple of questions, and then I'm going to get you to read so people can actually hear exactly what you're talking about.
I hope. All right, go ahead. Yeah.
No, they'll eat it up, I guarantee. So, do you think that that's part of the Celtic tradition? It seems very much to me you don't.
I don't know. I just find that that's a hard question, because there's all kinds of Celtic writers who don't do this and are excellent. You know, this is just.
But most of them seem to pay attention to rhythm.
Oh, yeah.
And to orality.
Okay, sure. Yeah. Well, yeah, maybe. I like the way things sound, you know. And sometimes I get a word, and I just love it. And I want to stick it in. You know. I say, who could say this? And I look at my character. But I just love the word. But it doesn't mean what it should, you know. So then I go to the Old English Dictionary and say, oh, maybe 400 BC or something, you know. It meant this, it never does. And then I say, and in one case I did, I said, I'm just going to stick it in there anyway, because I love the sound of it so much. And if somebody writes me or meets me on the street and says, listen, you use this word, and it doesn't mean, you know, the context is wrong for the true meaning of the word. But no one has ever found the word. It is my secret. But I'm interested in sound. You know.
So you write that one sentence, and then is the rhythm carrying over into the next sentence?
Oh.
So it's just all kind of flowing in that continuous rhythm.
No, it's hard work. You know.
But okay, so how do you, if you're writing that way, how do you keep in mind the structure? I mean, have you already mapped it out in your head, or you have an outline or something?
I have an outline, and I write in a scribbler. I was taught at the University of Windsor for a long time, so I have exam books that I pilfered from the exam books. So I write over here on the right-hand side of the page, and on the left-hand side of the page, I write down little directions to myself. Don't forget to make the parents older than the children. And things like that. Because even in this little story, you know, when you're talking about the war, you say, oh, this was 1942, or this is 1946. Like, you better get it right, you know. So I put on the left-hand side of the page things like that. And not in this story, But in a lot of the stories that I've written, I write the last sentence before I've come to the end, because I think the last sentence is important, because it's the last thing you're going to say to your readership. So I, over here, last sentence. And I feel it kind of like a lighthouse or something, you know, to where I'm going, because this is the last thing I'm going to say. So in the stories, I say, well, this is how I'm going to end this story. This is the last thing I'm going to say to the reader. There was not much left of my father physically as he lay there with the brass chains on his wrists and the seaweed in his hair. Or, and it is forever difficult to understand the tangled, twisted strands of love. Or, we have come from a great distance and have a long way now to go. Or, all of us are better when we're loved, you know. And if I don't have the sentence right away, I have the image. I say, I want to have this image of, you know, a tree blowing down, or the waves coming in, or going out, or something like that. It's the last thing I'm going to say. I had trouble with the last...
Yeah, you changed the ending.
Yeah, I had trouble with this ending. You know, I said, well, I want to say this. You know, but I had a little trouble with this end. But in my other work, generally I say, well, this is the last thing I'm going to say to the reader. You know, goodbye, you know, before the end. So I think it's important. You know.
Would you read something for us?
Maybe you'd say none of that stuff he's talking about is true. Okay, this is a description of a young man coming home from the war. And what he discovers is that while he has been away, his wife has had a child who is obviously not his child. When his troop ship finally landed in Halifax, it was snowing. He and most of the others were still in full uniform. On the dock, a fellow soldier offered to sell him an army rifle that he had smuggled across the ocean in his duffel bag. He had sawed off part of the barrel so it would fit into the bag, and then reattached the front sights to the shortened barrel. He also had a few shells, which he threw in as part of the bargain. The price of the transaction was $1. Later on the overcrowded train to northeastern Nova Scotia, there was a great deal of raucous celebration. Men drank openly from their brown bag bottles and sang off-color songs. Mothers tried to cover their young children's ears. A soldier stood in the aisle with a baseball bat he had borrowed from one of the children, while a friend pitched oranges to him. When the bat made contact, the oranges exploded, spraying the passengers with juice and seeds and mushy pulp. Through all this, some people slept and dreamed, and froth bubbled from their lips. When he finally arrived at his home, he went first to his in-laws' house, where he assumed his wife was staying. The house was hot and overcrowded and filled with women. His father-in-law had died during the previous winter, but no one had informed him. He hugged both of his daughters, one of whom had not been born when he had enlisted. From an adjoining room, his wife brought forth an energetic little boy. "This is another David MacDonald," she said. "Say hello to Daddy." The child, clearly under 2 years old, ran forward and hugged his brown serge pantley as if he had been rehearsing. The room lapsed into silence. He sat down, and the child sat on his lap and played with the buttons on his tunic. From the start, the child showed a fierce affection for him. He was later to think that perhaps he was a sort of novelty as a masculine presence in the house of so many women, but he could not be sure. For a brief time, he thought that his in-laws were encouraging the child to win over his affections, but he soon realized that could not be true. The child was too young, and his in-laws were not given to that sort of planned deception. He went to visit his own father, whom he found as austere as ever. "Well, what do you think?" asked his father. "Not much," he said, trying to sound as noncommittal as he could. He felt somehow that he should defend his wife against his father's strict morality, but he was not sure of that either. When he first lay with his wife, he was hesitant and uncertain. He remembered that in the barracks, soldiers had said that certain Arab or African men would not sleep with their wives if they knew their wives had experienced sexual relations with men other than themselves. He was not sure if this were true or if it mattered. He realized that a lot of the talk in the barracks bordered on the fantastical and was little more than nonsense. Still, he wondered if such talk was having an effect upon him, or if it was just his own personal situation. He wondered if he would be the same had he never heard such talk and never encountered what he had. Too late for that. His wife seemed mysterious. They had been in a married relationship for just over a year, and he was not sure if he had changed, or she had changed, or if it were the circumstances that surrounded them. Things did not go well under such circumstances. For a year and a half, he worked with his father cutting timbers for the nearby mine. Sometimes he slept at his in-laws' house and sometimes at his father's. His daughters enjoyed the attention lavished upon them by their young aunts, who were constantly arranging their hair, experimenting with lipstick and nail polish, or admiring the dress styles of the models in the Eaton's catalog. They showed no interest in their other glum grandfather, and relatively little in him. The young David MacDonald, however, was different. He burst into smiles whenever he saw him and tried to follow him everywhere. Sometimes when he visited his in-laws, he could see the child waiting at the window, as if he had been anticipating him for a long time. One winter evening, he left the house of his in-laws to take his father's horses back to their home barn. It was cold, and the horses snorted and tossed their heads impatiently as they cantered along the snow-covered road. After they reached the barn, he took his time unharnessing the horses and putting hay in the manger. As he was leaving the stable, he became aware of movement beneath the horse robes in the back of the sleigh. He discovered the child, who extended his arms so he could be lifted from the sleigh. The child wore only a light shirt and trousers and was blue with cold. There was frost on his eyelashes, and his cheeks were chilled by frozen tears. He threw his icy arms around his discoverer's neck and pressed his cold cheek against neglected whiskers. That night, when they were preparing for bed, he noticed that the child wore no underwear and was still shivering. He draped one of his flannel shirts upon the child's small frame and inserted the slender arms into the shirt sleeves. The shirt hung down beneath the boy's knees like the smock of an ancient monk. Later he wakened to the embrace of small arms around his neck and the pulsing body heat that emanated through the flannel and seemed to fuse their bodies closer together. Now, will I stop or will I read? I have another 2 pages.
You want to hear 2 more pages? The public has spoken.
What?
The public has spoken.
Public has spoken. All right. Now, that's all in third person, if you're interested in such a thing. And the last section I'm going to read, page and a half, is written in first person. I, I'm going to tell you now. And this I is this man's grandson. And he is a veterinarian, and he's in Toronto, and he's rich, because he looks after the animals of other rich people. But now he's coming back for this Remembrance Day with the man he sees as his father and as his grandfather. And there's a reference here to work as a veterinarian, and they're going to expand into selling animal aids or whatever, and they're thinking of branching out into puppy pajamas. There are such things. I see myself, all right, my grandfather sees myself as a link in a chain reaching back to the Second World War and its aftermath. He has never denied his love to save my father, and we will remember that. I do not know the intimacies of their lives, only what I have been told. But sometimes in Toronto, I lay aside the Journal of the American Veterinary Medical Association and put on hold my possible expansion into the world of puppy pajamas. And there comes to me the image of my father as a small, chill child without underwear, laying his tear-stained cheeks against the icy whiskers of the man he worshipped as his father. I do not know who my father's biological father was. And I do not know if even the senior David MacDonald knows. Perhaps the information died with my grandmother and her two daughters who were my aunts, often splayed out on the highway at the wooden bridge near Tatamagouche, never to make it to the New Brunswick border, nor to Montreal, where they were reported to be merry-go-rounds. Perhaps the young woman who was my grandmother was not only sexually enthusiastic, but also hopeful of leaving behind what she perceived as poverty and hopeful of starting a new life beyond the New Brunswick border. Because she was in a hurry to get on with her life, she left one of her children behind in the barn. The senior David MacDonald told me that he and his fellow soldiers once made a return visit to the Holland they had liberated years before. They were in their blazers and berets with their medals on their chests. They were older men, but still able to march in formation. The Dutch lined both sides of the streets and applauded them. He said that in Apeldoorn, among the congratulatory signs, he first noticed signs of a different nature. They were held up by middle-aged people and were directed at the Canadian soldiers. They asked the simple question, "Are you my father?" In 1946, it was reported that there were 7,000 children born of Canadian soldiers who were once stood in the Netherlands. These children too had in their way been left behind by young men who were eager to get on with their lives. Most of the old men were in marching formation and directed their eyes straight ahead. I put my car in gear and drive towards the waiting men. They will see my headlights coming through the trees. All of us are early on this Remembrance Day. All of our lives were affected by a war that brought its changes down upon us. Some of us were shaped by actions, and some by accident, as the past produced the present. I feel and hear the gravel turn as I drive toward the light. I go to stand and take my place within the continuum of time. The end.
Thank you. I presume that that's the first public reading.
This is the first public reading.
So it's an honor and a privilege for us to read. There were phrases in that reading about the taking a place in a continuum of time, chains of relationships and effects from the past that carry on into the present. And the notion that this time comes out of that time informs so much of your writing. It's not just this story, it occurs and reoccurs, that notion that you write about the present, but it's filled with exploratory excursions into the past. Do you know why that idea or notion interests you or preoccupies you?
No, I really don't, but it does interest me and it does preoccupy me. And I don't think that anybody is like an instant person, you know, that we all come from somewhere and we all come from some circumstance, and we may like where we came from or we may not like where we came from, and we may change our names or grow mustaches or, you know, whatever one might do. But I think that we are all products of the past. And there's an Australian, I guess, American writer now named Peter Carey. He lives in New York, but he's originally from Australia. And he did a novel a few years ago called The True History of the Kelly Gang. And these were kind of bandits in Australia. And he has an epigraph from Faulkner in the front of his novel. And it's something like, the past is not dead, it is not even past. So I think, you know, like even today with science, you know, like whatever you may be, like emotional, you know, there's this great interest in DNA and, you know, all that stuff, you know, if your mother and your grandmother and your great-grandmother all died of breast cancer, it'd be kind of silly to just say, here I am, and none of that stuff matters. So some people do that. But I think we're all kind of a combination of things that have built up within us, you know, and this is why we look the way we do. Perhaps this is why we eat what we eat, or I don't know. But I don't think that any of us are kind of just instant people, you know, that we just emerge from somewhere. And I really realize that a lot of people don't feel the way I do, you know, if they say, well, you know, here we are in 2012 in Vancouver, and that's all that matters. But I'm not like that. But I'm not saying that the way I look at the world is the only way to, you know, this is what's nice about writing. You can write, if you can find people who will read you, you can say anything you want. And so I think that's kind of interesting. Go ahead.
Oh, it's called remembrance, but there's a spirit of forgiveness that really pervades the story. How important to us as humans do you think it is to embrace or to practice forgiveness?
Well, it's kind of a hard question. You know, like there's one group of people who say, well, you stole all my land, and I forgive you, and I'm getting on with my life. There's another group who says, you stole all my land, and I want it back. You know, so I don't know just where forgiveness comes in, but this story is kind of interesting, I think, because of the fatherhood issue. You know, they should say, well, you know, this is not my child, but in the working out of the story, because the child is not capable of deviousness. So if somebody says, that's your father over there, you say, okay, if you're 2 or 3 or 4 and you continue to regard this person as your father, or you like him for some reason. I was kind of interested in households, because I was saying there's one house that's a very feminine household, you know, where there's a lot of young girls and they're dressing up and they put fingernail polish on one another, and you know, it's that kind of house. And it's another house full of kind of grumpy old men, you know, who pee in the barn and eat beans out of cans or something. And they're very different than the kind of more lively house, you know. And but we all know that these houses do exist. That over there they nights all night over here. They carve duck decoys or whatever, or whatever they do. And there's nothing particularly evil, but the person from one house would not be caught dead in the house of the other. Duck decoys, me, painting my fingernails, me, it's just different. So I think that although they are different, there is kind of, I tried for a kind of forgiveness. Oh, and did you notice that when I did my first person point of view in the last part, I put that in because I wanted the narrator, he of the puppy pajamas, to be telling you the story as he sees it. And he doesn't see very much because he's distanced from time, So he doesn't know who his biological grandfather is. He's just accepted the man he's regarded as his grandfather. Does the grandfather know who the other man was? I don't know. It doesn't come up. It's just, he's kind of, he with the puppy pajamas, is kind of living a kind of modern world, in a modern world. And he's rich because he neuters cats and puts splints on gerbils. So whether he goes into puppy pajamas or not, I don't know. But that's kind of like he has. He's a very kind of modern, affluent life.
Last question before we turn it over to the audience, and this is an easy one. It's sort of a, just kind of tell the truth. You ready?
I'm ready.
Okay, good.
Bring it on.
Your son, Alexander, a very fine writer, and here this evening, has told us that the two of you don't talk about writing. That's what he said, and I don't believe it's possible.
He's right. We talk about other people's writing. We talk about some of the people that are here, but we don't talk a lot about. I don't show him my work, and he doesn't show me his work, anything like that.
Wow. But you've read it. His work.
Oh yeah. Well, when he gives it to me. I gave him this today. So. Yeah. I don't know what to think about that, I think, as I said before, that if you're a good writer and you write about what you care about, you'll find readership. And for me to tell my son, or for him to tell me, let him try. How to write, everybody who writes has basic skills. You can spell, you can do things like that. But I teach writing quite a lot, and I just say to people, what do you care the most about? And they say, how much I love my mother, or how much I hate my mother. And I say, now this is what you really care most about? And they say, yeah. Say, okay, well then, this is your subject, so we'll just go forward with this, Sometimes when you're dealing with people that are 17 or 18, the people write about their ex-boyfriends or ex-girlfriends. And that is kind of limited, although, you can do that well too. Or how much they dislike their parents because they won't give them the cars. But once you get beyond that, like people care fiercely about things, people care fiercely about, Israel or Palestine, or how much they dislike their ex-boyfriend, they like you say, what do you care about? And that's what you make your art out of, I think. So for me to say to beginning writer, well, you better be interested in global warming, this will appeal to two people, but there'll be a whole lot of other people who say, well, I want to talk about my girlfriend, I don't want to talk about global warming, or, talk about child abuse, and say, two people will talk about child abuse. But the rest of them say, well, I don't want to talk about that, I want to talk about my boyfriend, you know. So I think that no matter, that if you care fiercely enough about it, that'll be your subject. And then the job is to try to make it as good as it can be. Like that.
Okay, can we have the house lights up? Oh yes, it's always this magic moment on the stage when it's because we haven't seen you very much from here. We've heard you.
Look at all of you.
All right, I'm not going to do the hand over the eye. I'm going to resist and try to see your hands. And so when you stand up, please say your question clearly, and we'll go from there. And I don't see a single hand.
There.
Now I do.
Hi. When you're writing one of your short stories, is it complete in your mind, or does it develop as you go along, the idea, the story itself?
When you write one of your short stories, does it...
I generally have it kind of complete in my mind before, like I think a lot, you know. This makes me sound more profound than I am. But I think a lot, you know. I say, okay, now this is going to be their family, you know. And this is what they worry about. They worry about something. And this is going to be their family. And this is going to be the age of the people in their family. And, you know, there's going to be 5 girls and 1 boy, and they're going to range in age from 5 to 19 or something like that. Then the father's going to die, and then what are they going to do? You know, or something will happen. There'll be the car accident, and then what? Or the mine will close. And you have to give this thought. You know, you should say, well, if I'm going to have a mother, or if I'm going to have a father, or whatever, they have to say something, they have to do something, they have to. So I say, okay, this is who I'm going to hug, you know, and this is going to be the issue. And that's the way I would. I had a film made of a story one time, and in the story, this couple had 6 children, but I only really kind of let 2 of them talk. So when they were making the film, the person said, well, what are these other 4 children doing? And I said, playing, you know. He said, well, you have to be better than that. Are we supposed to hire 4 child actors, and then you have to write dialogue for them? Oh, I said, no, it never entered my head. So, what he did, what we did, was we killed them. We didn't really kill them, but there was a voiceover in the film that said, and my mother also had lost 4 children at early stages of life. And they took pictures of, you know, the graveyard with those little lambs. Which was kind of interesting because, you know, like you can't have people that are just going to stand around. In this story, I have the man who was called the austere grandfather, who's one of those people who, as I say, is always reading the grocery bills aloud. You know? He's, I don't know if he's cheap, but he's, as they say, frugal. And so the young couple, when they get married, they move in with him because her house, they have no house of their own, her house is too crowded, and they move in with him, and he's no fun to live with. He doesn't like her. And I was going to give him a wife, you know, but then I said, what would she be like? I have to give her dialogue. And so I cleverly said, they moved in with his widowed father. So he had no wife, and I didn't have these hard, because you have to say, you know, you have to say, well, if you're going to have people in your story, well, they have to talk or they have to do things, you know, because people are going to be saying, what about Eliza sitting at the end of the table? She's been there for 2 days and hasn't said anything. You know, she's a deaf mute. Oh, now you now you can't tell me. But you have to kind of deal with these things. So that's the way that I work. You know, before I begin, I say, okay, it's going to be this. It's going to be this age, and this is going to happen, and then it'll work out its way. So. A lot of people I talk to say, oh, well then he just took over the story. Went this way, where I thought it was going to go that way. But that doesn't happen to me very often. I'm too much of a tyrant, I say. Don't you dare start taking over the story, or I'll have a tree fall on you on the next page. So that I'm in control of the story. But again, there's all kinds of ways of doing it, yeah.
Another question down here in the front.
Yes, in No Great Mischief, you use a bit of Gaelic in your writing. Are you fluent in Gaelic?
No. No, I'm not fluent in Gaelic, but I know a few words. My wife is quite fluent in Gaelic.